Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look back at my list. I've got my first object all the way down, getting larger as it goes. Next up, I'm going to pick the next largest object. For me, if I look, I've got cabins, bears, and rocks. So really, cabins is the next biggest object, because usually a cabin's bigger than a bear. Definitely bigger than a rock, hopefully. So I'm going to start out the same way I started out before. I'm going all the way back to the horizon line, and I'm going to be itty bitty teeny tiny. But the question for us is, how big is a cabin compared to a tree? We said trees are the biggest, so it's not going to be as tall as them. Maybe like 3/4 as tall. So maybe that's how big a cabin is. So I'm saying that my cabins are 3/4 as tall as trees. So when I go in to put them in the very back realm, they'll be 3/4 as tall as those trees. But when I come forward, these trees are bigger, aren't they? So 3/4 as tall as these trees ends up about that tall. Or 3/4 as tall as these trees. So each time you go down a level, I want you to look compared to what you're doing. Come up with a fraction or a proportion of how big one thing you're making is to the other. So if it's half as tall at the horizon line, then it should still be half as tall when you get down further. Now, the other thing that I know some of us are wondering is, Miss Walker, I got all this space in between. It kind of looks like they're lined up like things at a grocery store. Okay? The way you can figure out your in-between space is now that you have those two sizes, you can compare what would be in between those two sizes. So, for example, if I wanted a cabin in this no man's land right here, I know it has to be bigger than this, but smaller than this. Okay. I need to be slightly smaller, but not a ton. So I'm comparing, since I'm about halfway in between, I need to be about half as big. Or if I wanted a tree in between those two layers. These are my biggest and smallest. So I need to be somewhere in between those. And that way, you can have your correct size, because as you go down, everything should be getting bigger in proportion to the other objects. Okay? So don't let it go out of control where it's like, oh, my house was this small, now my house is this big. You know, keep it together. Yes? Well, a river is going to have to do with your path, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so if you're doing a fence, I'm going to go ahead and say like one of my cabins has a fence. Then you're thinking about how that rectangle would lay out. So it's still going to have to go back to the vanishing point. So in this particular case, you know, the fence that was parallel with us, we'd see. And then the other fencing would go towards the vanishing point. So it'd go that. And so I draw it like I'm drawing another trapezoid coming out. So this fencing ends up about right there. I can make my little slats for my fence. Maybe that's where I keep the horses. And I'm in a cabin in the woods. Feels like a horse would be an appropriate thing. But everything has to be in perspective to that vanishing point. If you've got a third or fourth object, for example, I have bears. Everybody loves a bear. I need to think about how big they are in comparison to what's already there. So compared to trees and compared to cabins. And a bear is probably like half as tall or 3/4 as tall as a cabin. let's say he's on his all fours. So he's going to be about half as tall. So here's this bear right here. He's going to look a little bit like a pig right now. But I'm sure you won't judge him because you're nice people. Alright, so I said he's about half as tall as that cabin. Okay, so over here, if he's about half as tall, he's still going to be a little bit smaller as he gets closer to the vanishing point. They're out hunting for food. If he's back here, and he's half as tall as a cabin, then we know he's going to almost just appear like a little blob. You're barely going to be able to see him. But as it gets closer, he's going to be bigger. And remember, you can overlap things. Overlapping is totally fine. He's going to be poking his head out from behind the tree. He's nosy. If you have another object, this is also a perfectly fine time to go in and add that other object. So, for example, I have some rocks. And I just want kind of like small boulders, like smaller than the bear, but like those big boulders like you would see in the yards along 119. Do y'all know which ones I'm talking about? Yeah. There's a yellow house that has tons of rocks in the yard. And anytime I think about rocks, that's always the yard that comes to my mind. Because I always wonder, man, how hard is it to mow that grass? How annoying must it be to have to get the weed whacker out to do half your yard?
Is there a gate that's going into it when you say like a long driveway?
I think so.
That's what Grandma says.
Oh my gosh, she has so many rocks.
Yeah, she's the mom and she was like big boulders and stuff.
Yes.
And she was like the
They're serious. I'll tell her I do not envy her yard keeping duties. Alright. So everybody's getting all their objects on. Put your hand on your head if you've got all your objects on. Okay. If you have on what you need right now, and you're waiting on us to do above the horizon line, then you can come in and start adding details. So this is a great time to add details. Keep in mind, you might be like, Miss Walker, it's so hard to draw details on this tiny little cabin back here. Well, yeah, it's because it's far away. And do you see lots of details on things that are far away? No. So you'll see more details and more extra stuff as you get closer and closer to the front. So don't worry if you're like, oh, I can't fit it. It makes sense. That means that you're staying in proportion. So like up here, Mom might be able to see the divide between them. And your details don't have to all be exactly the same. You may want to do like slightly different doors or trees, or maybe you've got slightly different some other small detail, like maybe you made a car. That's totally fine. Just think about what details there would be. Because that's part of what makes your picture really interesting. All right. Doing good.